Sikkim 365 and Baylor Plus have teamed up to bring Baylor fans the ultimate content bundle. You can sign up now for $17.99 a month, a $5 monthly savings, and get instant access to all premium content on both websites. For more information, visit either sikkim365.com or baylorplus.com today. What's up, Baylor family? Welcome into Inside Baylor Sports, the official daily podcast of Baylor Athletics. A lot of nothing going on right now with Baylor Sports. Women's basketball, next game is actually tomorrow night against Utah Tech, but we don't have anything to discuss there. Men's basketball doesn't return to action until December 27th against Arlington Baptist. Now, both of those teams will begin Big 12 play before the end of the month, but right now, just not a lot to discuss. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to look back on a few Baylor Bowl games dating back to the 2010 season and look at the top offensive individual performances from these games. We're getting ready for the Texas Bowl against LSU, and we're going to have a lot of previews for that. But it's really cool as I started going back and looking at these lists. Like there's basically been 10 or 11 bowl games dating back to 2010 that Baylor has played in. The 12th this year since 2010 will be against LSU in the Texas Bowl. But there was a lot of big individual offensive performance, obviously defense as well. We're going to do that later this week. But the biggest offensive performances for individuals, there's been a lot of them. And it really, at a variety of positions. And obviously some of that goes back to the Art Briles years, but some of that also in the Matt Rule era as well. And then in the Dave Aranda era as well. And so we both, Grayson and I, looked through the list and created a consensus of what our top five would be. And we're going to start with number 5. And this one really reflective of this year as well. It was Charlie Brewer against Vanderbilt in the Texas Bowl. And Grayson, I know you looked at this game, but I forgot how impressive he actually was in this game. Now, Vanderbilt wasn't the best defense. That game evolved into a shootout. But overall, he was Baylor's offensive star in that game.
He was, and he was tremendous. I remember him being really good, but when I looked through the numbers again, I forgot he had 100 yards rushing. That was the one that really stood out to me. People forget how good Charlie was in 2018. It's because they were, barely a bowl team. They didn't really have a bunch of impressive wins. It was just kind of beating who you're supposed to beat. But I think people forget because the defense was so bad. So it was like they were having to play keep up in a lot of games. There were some games where he put up some empty numbers. But in general, I think 2018 was the best Charlie Brewer we saw during his career. He went into that Vanderbilt game. The reason it's number 5 on the list is because, the opponent definitely, I had to weigh that in a little bit. Vanderbilt was fine, but Baylor really just kind of took advantage of a lot of things. And like you said, 384 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, 109 yards rushing, another touchdown there. And I do have to mention as we go through this, because the offense was so good, you also have to mention there was another really good performance in this game that deserves just a nod to it. And that was Treston Ebner, 199 yards of total offense and 2 touchdowns on just 16 touches. He was the big playmaker for Baylor on the day and the guy that Charlie Brewer was able to find quite a bit in the passing game as well. So overall, a great performance and a huge Baylor win that really catapulted them into that 2019 season.
Yeah, so final score 45-38. And you mentioned Treston Ebner. He took like an angle route out of the backfield on one of those plays. And it's crazy to think he ended up being on the 21 Big 12 championship as well. So he played in that 2018 bowl game, 2019, that was the runner-up, finished second place in the Big 12 that year to Oklahoma, and then on the 21 team. But Charlie Brewer, you mentioned it, man, like before he really started dealing with injuries and concussions and stuff, really through the beginning of the 2019 season, he was really good. And then everyone, soured on Charlie during 2020. But this is just kind of another game for him in that stretch where he was playing really good football. And obviously in a bowl game postseason over an SEC team, even though it's Vanderbilt, it was an SEC team in the moment, and they were kind of trending up during that era. I think it was the Derek Mason era, and really cool opportunity for that team in that game. Matt Rule's second year of the program, back to bowl eligibility, won 7 games. And then if you remember, they had beat Texas Tech to get bowl eligible. So that was their first win. The second win was the Vanderbilt game. And then they won they start off 9-0 that next year before losing to Oklahoma, or 7-0.
Yeah, it might have even been more than that. It might have been like 10-0. It was late in the year when they lost to Oklahoma. So you're right, 8 or 9, and yeah, ranked really high. And then of course went to the Big 12 championship, competed there. Ebner had a very similar touchdown in that Big 12 championship game, and then of course, not much to take away from that 2019 Sugar Bowl game that we're going to discuss on this podcast, but that's how these things go. But they had a great run, and this game really did in some ways start that.
Yeah, it was. So moving on to the next one, this was a performance where an offensive guy did not score a touchdown, but was really impressive and kind of put the nation on notice for that particular offensive scheme. And that was Abram Smith versus Ole Miss in the Sugar Bowl. 25 carries, 172 rushing yards, 6.9 yards per carry. Baylor beats Ole Miss 21-7. And you say, man, how do you not score a touchdown? But that performance by Abram, everyone had seen it. If you were a Baylor fan, you had seen the way he was physically imposing on defenders. And in that game, time after time, he was just finishing runs so hard through the Ole Miss defense. And that was a game that Baylor didn't score. Gary Bohannon was dinged up. He had to come back because Blake Shapen got injured. So Gary Bohannon's playing basically on one hamstring. 25 carries, 172 yards for Abram Smith. He just set the tone throughout that game, and really it was a punctuation on his exclamation point, I guess I should say, to his career as a running back at Baylor.
It was fantastic, and it was kind of everything that they had done all year long. It kind of culminated in one game for him at least. And the thing that made this so impressive, and we can talk about how injured Gary was. Either way, he was not good at all in this game, and completely just was a non-factor. That, and everyone in the stands, the whole defense knew they were not throwing the football, and Gary wasn't running the football either. And so it was basically just like, all right, if they can stop Abram, Ole Miss is probably going to win this game. And they couldn't stop Abram. And he kept running and running. And, the big play in that game was the Monterey Baldwin touchdown. But that is all set up because of how effective they were running the ball up the middle and with their wide zone. They stretched the defense and then finally hit them for the big play with Monterey. This was such an impressive performance. It's not going to be one statistically that you look at and go, oh my gosh, this is just the most crazy performance. But what it is a dominant performance, a performance that was needed for Baylor to win a game, and it came in the Sugar Bowl at one of the biggest stages you could possibly play in. Abram was terrific in this one, and he definitely deserves to be in the top 5 because of just the whole environment in general of what was going on. He still kind of rose to the occasion. And to be honest, after the Oklahoma State game in the Big 12 championship, he looked banged up in that game. He didn't look like himself against Oklahoma State, and Oklahoma State had a good game plan for him. But in this game, it looked like he got back to shape and just kept running the football. The offensive line was doing their, pushing him forward thing that they had done all year long, getting behind him, pushing him another, 15 yards. And in general, it's just a great performance by him at a crucial time in a massive game.
Yeah, and I think in that game, the Al Walcott had the pick 6, and then the touchdown pass, I guess it was from Gary. It was like a 1-yard pass. It was a screen pass. Like the offensive fireworks were not there. Yeah. So Taquan and Taquan Thornton. But yeah, it was just a weird offensive performance. But the highlight of that game was obviously the defense and the way they played against Ole Miss's offense. 7 sacks or something crazy in that game. And we'll talk about that later this week when we discuss these defensive performances in bowl season dating back to 2010. So that's number 4, Abram Smith versus Ole Miss in the Sugar Bowl 2021. Number 3 is kind of a forgotten performance as well. This was one I had forgotten. I mean, it was completely forgotten, and maybe because of the circumstances of the season. It was against Boise State in the Cactus Bowl. Katie Cannon. I mean, Zach Smith had a really good game. It's kind of an honorable mention of this one, throwing the football. But Katie Cannon was like, all right, I'm probably leaving. And he did leave. He left school early after his junior year. I'm going to just go ahead and go out with a bang. And tremendous game. I mean, insane game. Now, it didn't result in him getting drafted or anything like that, sticking in the NFL. But 14 catches, 226 yards, 2 touchdowns. He had 3 different receptions for over 30 yards, 49, 30, and 68. And I believe the 49 and the 68 were touchdown receptions in that game. And a game that Baylor won 31-12 over Boise State, and just kind of out of nowhere, because the way that team finished the year was tough. I mean, they were they 6-0 at one point in that season, finished on a 6-game losing streak, and then won the bowl game. But Katie Cannon in that game was really, really good.
Right. And this was the year where, they started 6-0, should have beaten Texas, got some really terrible calls in that game that would have made it 7-0. And then they went into that TCU game and just got absolutely blown out. And then from there on, it was a bad year. Seth Russell hurt his ankle against Oklahoma and didn't play the rest of the year. So I think he only played in the first 8 or 9 games. And it really impacted them late. And Zach Smith played well at times. But I think we've kind of seen how his career played out. He was a fine quarterback, not an elite one. And so I think going into this game, Zach Smith throws for 375 yards. That's great. But 226 of those went to KD Cannon. And I remember, like, we went through this list and we were looking through these, and I had forgotten how good this performance was. But right when I saw it, I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, I remember how I was feeling during that game where KD Cannon is just unguardable the whole game. Yeah. Boise State had zero answer. Felt like they didn't make any adjustments to try to stop him at all. And he just was dominant. And KD had a couple good performances. We'll probably get to one that, he's not going to be the guy on the list, but he had another really good performance in a big moment for a Baylor bowl game as well. But this one was definitely his biggest highlight in my eyes during his time at Baylor.
Yeah, so KD Cannon, and then another receiver in that game, Ish Zamora. I don't even have his stat line in front of me, but those are two guys who probably should have come back for another year. Matt Rule was there the next year, and I think that they wanted him to come back. They just decided to move on, and then never got a chance in the NFL. But those are two guys extremely talented, and had they come back, who knows where that 2017 could have been. Even though there's plenty of issues for that particular season, those two guys were key parts to what could have been for that season. So, yeah, KD Cannon, you mentioned it had a lot of big games in his career, but that might have been the biggest one. Not necessarily opponent or stage, minor bowl game, but was a really big in that particular game. Any final thoughts on KD's?
Yeah, one thing I want to mention from that, you mentioned them possibly coming back. I'm hoping I'm remembering this correctly, but I think the bowl game had Matt Rule come on during the game because I think he'd been hired already, and he's watching KD Cannon score these touchdowns. They're like, oh man, like something about, it'd be great to get him back.
Rule was saying I remember that. That was because Baylor, Mac Rhodes hired Matt Rule, and this is before the early signing period. This is like, it was a really strange transition because Jim Grobe's still coaching that game, and Matt Rule's there, and who's Matt Rule going to keep from the staff? All this stuff, all these questions are going on, and he's there at the game commenting on it, and there was a lot of talent in that game, obviously left over from the Art Briles era, and KD was one of those. So that was number 3, KD Cannon versus Boise State. Number 2, speaking of not making adjustments, this is not an individual, even though we will mention several individuals. This is just Baylor's offensive line versus North Carolina in the Russell Athletic Bowl. 645 rushing yards. North Carolina just, you should have just lined up and field goal blocked the entire game, and they didn't do it. 7 touchdowns. And we'll go through all of the list here, but Johnny Jefferson kind of highlighted that entire game, got to 1,000 yards rushing because of this game when it was completely not even on the radar of being a remote possibility, because he rushed for 299 yards and 3 touchdowns in that game. 40 touchdown scores. I have it on here, 41, 27, and 80 yards of touchdown runs of his 3 touchdowns runs. But that offensive line, talk about what's coming and you can't stop it. That's what that offensive line did. They had a full month to prepare for that game after the end of the season, and they were prepared for that game and running the Wildcat quarterback, and North Carolina had no prayer stopping them.
No, they really didn't. And that was, just being at that game was something special. Just simply watching Baylor just turn around, hand the ball off, at times not turn around because they were just putting Johnny Jefferson in Wildcat a lot of the game. Chris Johnson had his struggles. I still firmly believe had Chris Johnson not gotten hurt against Texas, they probably win that game. But by this point, Chris just really was struggling throwing the football, and their best option was running the ball. And then it's just it's deeper than that, because it comes out, Johnny was dealing with a whole lot of stuff going into this game and still shows up and just completely takes over this game. The hard part for me to say just him for the individual performance, it's difficult because Devin Chafin had 156 yards and Terrence Williams had 92 yards and 2 touchdowns. So it was very much just the offensive line dominating. I believe this was a game where the lead up to it was, is Spencer Drango going to play in this game? I think there was questions about that, and he did, and he played really well. And that whole offensive line just dominated. It was one of those games where it's just like, I think Baylor fans had been kind of watching the season play out and just been disappointed because it felt like that was potentially Baylor's best team ever. And it kind of fell apart late. They had some really close games. They lost the iceberg, whatever storm you want to call that 2015 game against TCU, where it's just an utter disaster and they somehow lose that game. And it all goes into this game and there aren't that many expectations. And Baylor just turns around and just says, hey, you know what? We're going to run the football right at North Carolina the entire game. And they did it, and did it very effectively. It was so impressive. And one of the better coached games in my eyes for Art Briles, just because showing up to a game like this with basically no quarterback and finding a game plan in which you put up these kind of numbers, so impressive.
Yeah, Lynx Hawthorne, who is basically running Wildcat quarterback, 7 carries, 63 yards, and a touchdown. Chris Johnson then, as the quarterback, 9 carries for 36 yards, but resulted in 84 carries, 645 yards, 7 touchdowns, and 49 points. North Carolina did score 38 points, and that was the takeaway from the end of that game, was that Baylor's defense didn't play that well. That Larry Fedora offense was really talented, though, and that was expected, but no one expected Baylor's offense to do what they did. I don't even know what the final passing total was for that game, but I think Johnny Jefferson had a 25-yard pass, and Lynx might have had a completion, and Chris obviously had a few in there. But yeah, extremely impressive in a game that you want to go back and watch, just because it was just like they figured out how to run the football. And you go back to the end of that season after Seth Russell got hurt, and they obviously go through the quarterbacks that they had. But if they would have figured out how to do this in that Texas game, they probably win that game. And they did it a little bit with Lynx late, but they tried to run their traditional offense with him at times too. Just didn't work. But then they learned from it and came into this game and executed at an extremely high level.
Well, Colt, the problem in that Texas game too was early on, Chris Johnson got hurt. So they were trying to figure out, okay, what do you do now? And if you remember the second half, they were down like 21-0 or something. And then they started running the Wildcat with Johnny Jefferson. And truthfully, I'm not going to put it all on Johnny, but Baylor had the ball with plenty of time and Johnny fumbled the football, or else they probably would have won that game regardless of the fact that they started so slow.
Yeah, they did. It did take them a little while. And Chris, when Chris got hurt in that game, I guess he was actually running the football. I don't know if it was on a scramble or where it was.
He got
hit really hard. And unfortunately, I think they knew that they were going to have to run the football to win that game, and they had to expose him, but then they didn't have another quarterback after that. So really difficult. But they rebounded in the bowl game, obviously, to a really solid performance. And so now, number one on our list, you have 4 games that Baylor won, and this is a game that Baylor lost in heartbreaking fashion. But Bryce Petty against Michigan State in the Cotton Bowl, 2014 Cotton Bowl. I mean, maybe – I don't know if there's a better performance in his career or by a Baylor quarterback throwing the football, but 36 of 51 for 550 yards, 3 touchdowns, 3 touchdown passes of 49, 53, and 74. And that was a game Baylor could not run the football. Michigan State was not going to let him run the football, and that's ultimately what cost them this game. But Bryce Petty was elite in this game, connecting downfield, connecting on short pass, everything that he could do, he did it. But Baylor lost, and that was pretty devastating. But that was the obviously his last game as a Bear, and I'm sure that even though he lost that game, I'm sure Bryce would tell you he absolutely remembers it, probably down to the snap that he took on those 51 pass attempts for 550 yards.
Yeah, and I mean, I remember every single one as well. I mean, that game was truly devastating because Bryce Petty was just masterful. I mean, he was like a surgeon, and they're throwing that thing deep downfield. Katie Cann's running by people. Corey Coleman is making people miss in the open field. I mean, it truly was something to watch because they couldn't run the ball. Yeah. Michigan State was basically saying, we're not going to let you run the ball. And Baylor was like, perfect, because we don't really need to run the ball. We're going to throw it all over the field. Yeah. And unfortunately, I mean, yes, they couldn't run the ball, and yes, that sort of cost them, but really you can just look at 2 penalties that cost them this game. The Taylor Young return for a touchdown, which Andrew Billings pushes the guy in the back for no reason. And then Corey Coleman's huge play that got down to the 1 yard line, and they called a face mask on him.
Offensive face mask.
Offensive face mask, just 2 truly devastating calls there. But Katie Cannon finished 8 for 197 and 2 touchdowns. Corey Coleman 7 for 150 and 1. But Petty was masterful all game. He really needed like one more throw that would have won them this game. And unfortunately, 550 yards passing and 4 total touchdowns wasn't quite enough, which is rather shocking. He did have negative 36 yards rushing because he was sacked quite a few times, especially late in this game. But I also want to mention one thing with Petty. Petty in 2 big bowl games, like their biggest moments where Baylor really needed him. And yes, they lost both. I mean, he showed up. I mean, 906 yards passing and 9 touchdowns in their 2 BCS bowl games. Incredible stuff. And this one by Petty against Michigan State, it felt like the whole team was on his back, and he carried them almost to the finish line, but unfortunately just not quite enough.
Yeah, was that the game that one of the passing touchdowns was to Quan McGowan in the Cotton Bowl?
Yeah, and the moment after he caught that touchdown, everything went downhill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was kind of like everyone relaxed, and you think the game's over. You go viral before the game's even over because of the touchdown to Laquan. And yeah, I mean, that was one of those games too, that if you win that game, you justify your argument of being left out of the playoff. That TCU justified theirs with their victory over Ole Miss. But where that game was going, Baylor was up by what, 20 points, 21 points. And
I think it might have even been more than that, right? What, 41-20 or 41-13 or something?
It was at least
like
3 touchdowns.
Yeah.
And you win that game the way that they were winning that game, and you justify, and you don't know what that propels you to moving forward for obviously the 2015 season, but even beyond. You say we're a legit program. We throttled a really good Michigan. That Michigan State team was really good that year. That was like kind of the biggest national champion. That was the first year of the playoff, but the biggest non-playoff game. I mean, it was the game, and everyone talked about how good those 2 teams were, and they let it get away. And I remember being in that game. I was actually in San Antonio covering the Army Bowl. I was down there covering recruiting, and drove up 35 all the way to Dallas to watch that game early that morning. And that was the longest trip back to San Antonio after that game. I mean, just like devastating. I mean, like you think about the 2022 game against TCU, which was in season, you lose that way. This was the equivalence of that, but much bigger stage for the program. And that was really devastating game. And but Bryce Petty was awesome, and like he was throughout most of his career at Baylor. So honorable mention, one game, and I don't know which one you want to mention here if you have one, but mine was Terrence Ganaway, 2011 Washington versus Washington in the Alamo Bowl, 21 carries, 200 yards, and 5 touchdowns. That was a game where Robert Griffin got all the attention. He just won the Heisman Trophy. Robert had a solid game, but not anywhere for this to put on this list. But Terrence was absolutely like, it was hard for me to say he wasn't on this list because of that game, but was really impressive. Jared Sluby also had a really good game, but Baylor ran the ball all over Washington in the shootout for that particular game. Had to mention him because of what he did for that 2011 team.
Yeah, the only reason he didn't make it for me was because you said, RG3 had an okay game, and I'm like, 350 total yards of offense, 2 touchdowns, and he completed nearly 73% of his passes. He was pretty awesome in that game. It's just Ganaway got the touchdowns. And so, that's why it was hard for me, right? Because they both played so good in that game. So it's hard to just pick one. For me, I alluded to it, but it's the Petty game in the Fiesta Bowl. I don't think that game gets as much credit because there were times where it feels like, he missed this throw, or, they lost the game in a horrible fashion against a team they should have beaten. But I truly think that game had a lot to do with the wide receivers. Like Tevin Reese and Antoine Goodley were nowhere to be found. And it was a whole lot of Corey Coleman and Jay Lee kind of before they were, maybe they were ready, but it was a little before their emergence as the guys that
it wasn't 2014. It wasn't 2014 or 2015 for them.
No, it wasn't. And so Petty's having to work with those two because Reese and Goodley just didn't have it that night. And he showed up and had 5 touchdowns in that game. I just don't think people quite remember it that way because of the end result, but it could have been a lot bigger too. They had a few missed opportunities that really, I mean, he could have had another 500-yard type game, but it didn't quite go down that way. So I wanted to mention that because I do feel like it's a bit of an underrated performance because of the score.
Yeah, it was. And that was a game the defense just didn't show up either.
Yeah.
They got down big early in that game and had to battle back. And you thought once they got on track, okay, they're going to come back and win this game. But UCF with Blake Bortles, extremely talented. Obviously, after that game, Blake Bortles blows up, and he was like top 10 pick in that next.
Didn't he go number 1?
Was it number 1? I don't remember what it was, but
something like that.
But then that was kind of his highlight of his career after beating Baylor and then going into the NFL and didn't do much after that. So, yeah, really great offensive performances. A little later this week, we'll bring you the defensive performances from this same era. There should be – I haven't really dug into it. I haven't really looked into it yet, but there should be some pretty good ones. I think about the Ole Miss game specifically, 7 sacks. I don't even remember who had the 7 sacks, but there were some fun things to talk about from those particular games. So, all right, Baylor family, that's going to do it for this episode of Inside Baylor Sports. For Grayson Grudenhafer, I'm Colt Barber. Have a great Tuesday and sick 'em Bears.